Everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Susan Kemp. I'm the manager of the International Student Support Office here at OCAD. And I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speakers for today. So joining us today, we have Elizabeth Long and Mary McDonald they're both immigration lawyers from LM Law Group here in Toronto. And as you probably know, there have been a lot of recent changes to the rules for international students in Canada. So we're really happy to have Elizabeth and Mary here with us today to go over some of those and to share their knowledge and expertise with you. So with that, I'll turn things over to you, Elizabeth, to get started.
Thank you so much. It's always great to be here with you guys today. As Susan has said, there's a lot of changes that have been taking place just over the last few months. And so today we're going to go over things that you need to understand when you are applying for work permits and while you're on your study permit, how to extend those. And then we're going to talk about some pathways towards permanent residence. And then at the end, we're going to have a question and answer period when you can ask some questions as well. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Now, please be aware that this is a recording. We will be recording this, and it will be put on YouTube. So please don't ask any personal questions. We won't be answering, this happened to me and what we're not going to, this is not the forum for that. But if you have general questions, I'm sure if you have a question, other people probably have similar questions as well. Please feel free to share them on the Q&A button. Yes, and we'll be sending out the slides to everyone as well who has registered. All right, let's get started. Okay, so what do you need to know? First thing we're going to talk about is temporary residence. Temporary residence is where you have your study permit or your work permit or visitor status in Canada. And the first thing we wanted to cover is what do you need to do in order to keep your status when you have your study permit. So the law is that you have to actively pursue your studies. Otherwise, you lose your status after 90 days of not actively pursuing your studies. What does actively pursuing studies mean? It means you're registered as a full-time, well, you don't have to be registered as a full-time student to be actively pursuing studies, but you have to be registered as a student. You have to be going to classes, you're taking your final exams. Um, you're a student per se. Uh, there are two exceptions to the rule. One is scheduled breaks. Scheduled breaks are whatever is on the academic calendar. For example, your summer break or your, spring break or whatever break there is, that's everybody else in your program has, that's fine, okay? And then there's authorized leave. Authorized leave is where you ask for a personal leave from the school. So you can have authorized leave for up to 150 days or otherwise 1 semester, where if you get permission from the school beforehand, you can take that time off, and that's still counted as actively pursuing your study so you don't lose your status. But be aware that if you do take your authorized leave, that you are not then able to work while you're studying, because in order to work while you're studying, you have to be registered as a full-time student, except in the last semester. In the last semester, you could be a part-time student and you could still be able to work. Now, very importantly, once you've stopped studying, once you've completed your studies, you're no longer considered a student and you have to stop working right there and then. The only exception to the rule is if you have um, finished your program and you have been accepted to another program and there's a semester in between, you can work up to 150 days for the semester in between the two programs.
Okay, so it's also very important to properly maintain that student status while you're here and you're studying. So, in order to do that, you need to apply for study permit extensions if you do need them. So, if your study permit is going to expire before your program is going to finish, you need to apply for an extension before the expiry date on your study permit. If you apply for an extension before your study permit expires, and as long as you submit all the proper forms and you pay the correct fees, then you'll have what's called implied or maintained status. So, implied status allows you to continue studying while you wait for a decision to be made on your study permit, but it does require you to be inside of Canada while you wait for that decision on the new application. So, if you leave Canada, your implied status does end. So, another thing to note is about restoration. So, if, for example, you realize that your study permit did expire and you didn't apply for an extension in time, you may still be in what's called the restoration period. So, if you are within 90 days of the expiry date on your study permit, then you're able to apply for restoration and get back into status once that application is approved. But it's really important to note that that 90-day deadline is very strict. So it's 90 days from the expiry on your study permit. That's your restoration deadline. This also applies if you apply to extend your study permit. And then let's say if that extension is refused, then it's 90 days from the day of the refusal on your study permit extension. That's when your restoration period begins.
So, Mary,
Uh,
I have a lot of questions
yeah,
about extension that ex, WPEXT let.
yes.
So, for example, when someone is applying for a work permit extension, um, or your postgrad work permit, and you get a letter from IRCC that's in your portal, which says you have the ability to work until such and such date or decision until a decision is made, whichever comes first. What does that date mean?
Right. Yeah, we do get a lot of questions about that. So that date is actually pretty much arbitrary. It's given by immigration. It roughly corresponds to the estimated processing time, but it actually has no bearing from a legal point of view. Legally, you are allowed to continue working on implied status until a decision is made on your application, regardless of if it's after that 180 days that they give or before or that date has passed or not. That actually has no bearing on your implied status. So we do get a lot of questions about that. I believe IRCC sent out a pretty confusing email the other week for a lot of applicants. That work permit extension deadline is totally irrelevant to your implied status.
We're going to be sending out an email to everybody on our list. So if you've registered for the webinar, we'll add you to the list as well. You can show it to your employers um, to to dispel this myth that that letter A gives you status. It doesn't give you any status. It's just a letter confirming that you've submitted your application and you have some status. It's useful for OHIP. You can give it to your employer, but sometimes it confuses the employer because it makes the employer think that you lose your status after such and such date. So we'll be sending out an email to everyone on our list, and we'll add you to the list to explain about that. Okay.
Okay, and so recently IRCC also switched up the rules about study permit extensions, especially when you're changing between different schools. So let's go through these new changes. So it used to be that you could just apply to extend your study permit, and if you needed to change schools, you could inform IRCC about that change. But the rules have become more restrictive lately. So if you're finishing one program at your school and then you're planning to start another program at the same school, as long as your study permit is still valid, you can continue studying on the same permit as long as you're attending the same DLI. But if you're planning on changing your DLI, then you do need to apply for a new study permit, and you have to wait until that study permit is approved before you can start, unless you meet some of the exceptions that IRCC has listed, like if your old program was suspended or the program closed or it lost its DLI designation. In that case, you can study before the study permit is approved, but in most situations, you're going to have to wait for the new study permit to get approved if you're changing your DLI. The IRCC has also introduced the provincial attestation letter requirement, or the PAL, and that came in the last 2 years or so. But when it's a bit confusing about when you need a PAL or when you don't need a PAL with these study permit extensions. So you do need a PAL if you're applying for a new program at a different DLI, and the new PAL would need to be submitted with your new study permit application. You also need a new PAL if you're staying at the same school but changing your level of study and your initial study permit is expiring. So if you have to apply for an extension and you're in a new program at the same school, you do need a PAL. And then you also, there are some important exceptions to who needs a PAL. So we are listing those on the website there. Do take a look at them when we post these slides because these rules are changing pretty quickly. So you want to double check that. And then finally, there's also the field of study requirement. So IRCC has introduced a field of study requirement for non-degree program graduates to qualify for a postgrad work permit. So if you apply for a second program after November 1st, 2024, that's not a degree program, then the field of study requirement will apply to your postgrad work permit eligibility for the second program.
So Mary, let's just go through a few scenarios. Let's
Sure.
say I am just finishing up my undergrad at OCAD and I want to go to do a master's at OCAD. My study permit does not expire for another year. Do I need to get a new study permit in order to start studying for the master's program?
So you don't need to get a new study permit to start studying in the master's program, but if your master's program is going to go past the duration of your current study permit, before your current study permit expires, you will need to extend it. And in that case, you will need a new PAL.
Okay. What if I wanted to go to start doing a master's at another university? Let's say I wanted to do it at U of T. Then do I need to, but my study permit is still good. Do I need to apply for a new study permit to study at U of T for the master's?
So in that case, because you're changing your DLI, you do need to apply for a new study permit to go pursue the master's.
What if I wanted to, I didn't want to do another master's, but I wanted to do another college program. Let's say I wanted to do something at Sheridan College. Um, so then could I get my postgrad work permit if I have my undergrad, but now I want to do another program at Sheridan?
So in that situation, you'll need to apply for a new study permit, and you also will be subject to the field of study requirement. So on IRCC's website, you need to go check if your program at Sheraton would fall under the field of study that they have for postgrad work permit eligibility.
Okay, great. And that leads us to the next slide, which is postgrad work permits. All right. So here's the thing about postgrad work permits. It is one of the big advantages to studying in Canada, or used to be. But they recently changed the rules. Okay. So for most of you, you would have likely applied for your study permit before November 1st of last year. So likely on your current program, you can qualify for a postgrad work permit. Now, before you just go and apply for a postgrad work permit, there's a few things that you will need to consider. First thing is, how many postgrad work permits can you get in your lifetime? One. Okay. One. That means that if your postgrad work permit runs out of time, you may not be able to extend your your work permit. You may need to leave Canada if you're not able to get permanent residence. So you have to consider what can you do with your current postgrad work permit, because also the length of your postgrad work permit is depending on the program. If you're doing a master's, what doesn't matter what program it is, you have it doesn't matter the length of the program, you can get a 3-year work permit. But the non-master's program, it will depend on the length of the program. So if it's under the 2-year, 8 months to 2 years, you get the length of the program. If I did a 1-year program and it's not a master's, I get a 1-year postgrad work permit. Now, you can stack the program. So if I did a 1-year program and another 1-year program, then technically, before I could get a 3-year work permit. But you do have to now keep in mind, does the second program, because second program, if you applied for the study permit for the second program after November 1st, then the second program will need to meet the field of study. Okay, and the field of study for the second program, if it doesn't, then you won't get your postgrad work permit at all. So um, especially if it's for a non-degree program. Okay, so that's something that you need to consider. And otherwise, you have to consider whether or not you would qualify for postgrad work permit. So for example, distance education, it has to be less than 50% of your program, or else you won't qualify for the postgrad work permit. Okay, and you have to have met and maintained your full-time status for every single semester except the last semester of your program. Otherwise, you won't qualify for the postgrad work permit. Sometimes I have students come to me and they say, Elizabeth, this semester is really hard for me. I'm maybe experiencing some health challenges, or there might be some courses that are really difficult, and I'm probably going to fail these courses. I'm going to drop these courses so that it doesn't show up on my transcript. Well, you have to be very careful if you're going to be doing that, because if you drop some courses and you go down to part-time student status, guess what? You may have to do another program in order to qualify for the postgrad work permit. Because to qualify for the postgrad work permit, unless it's in the last semester, you have to be a full-time student in every semester. In that case, I would rather someone fail, get an F on the transcript, but at least it shows they were a full-time student throughout the entire semester. All right. Finally, let's talk about when you should apply for your postgrad work permit. My advice is normally for you to apply for your postgrad work permit while your study permit is still valid and within 90 days of you finishing your program. Why 90 days when the IRCC website says you can apply within 180 days? Because you lose your student status after 90 days of you finishing your studies. So if you apply after the 90 days, you won't be able to work while waiting for your work permit. Okay? So if you apply within 90 days and while your study permit is still valid, then you can work while you're waiting for your work permit, as long as you stay in the country while waiting for your work permit. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit timeline about when you can start working or work at the end of your program. Let's say you're writing your final exams. Have you graduated? No, you're still writing your final exams. So you can work at that point. You're waiting for your results. Have you graduated? No, you're waiting for your results. So you can work at that time. Okay. Now, the school has notified you that you have now completed your program. At that point, IRCC says, now you completed your program, you are no longer a student. So at that point, once you receive the first notification from the school, whether it's on your portal, whether or not it's a letter or a transcript, the first indication, you have to stop studying then. And when can you start working again? If you submit your work permit application within 90 days of your program completion and while your study permit is still valid, and you can start working full-time then.
Okay, so IRCC has also made some changes recently regarding the eligibility for spouses to work in Canada. So it used to be that if you were studying in Canada, your spouse could get a work permit to accompany you, but IRCC made changes and now spouses can only get a work permit to accompany you in certain situations. So for students, the spouse of a student can only qualify for a work permit if their spouse is studying in a master's program of at least 16 months in duration, or a PhD, or within selected professional programs that are on IRCC's websites. For workers, so for those of you who might be transitioning to postgrad work permit in the coming months and you have your spouse here, your spouse can only get a work permit if you have a job offer in a tier 0 or 1 or in selected tier 2 or 3 occupations. And your work permit needs to be valid for at least 16 months when the application is submitted. There is an exception here for people who are going to be applying for what's called a bridging open work permit, where essentially if you're transitioning to permanent residence, then you may still be able to have your spouse get a work permit there too. And these rules also impact people who already have work permits. So if your spouse is already here on a work permit, what are the rules for their extension? So if you are a student, your spouse can apply to extend their work permit for the same duration as your existing study permit. And if you're working, then your spouse can apply to extend their work permit the period of the family member's existing work permit.
Okay. Great. Oh, all right. All right, so let's move on to permanent residence.
Okay, so when we talk about permanent residence, one of the key things to understand from the beginning is the difference between high skilled and low skilled work. So IRCC has sorted every job into high skilled versus low skilled knock codes. So a knock code it's a national occupation classification code, and it has different tier levels. So in the code, tier 0, 1, 2, and 3 are considered high skilled, and tier 4 and 5 are considered low skilled. And the way your job fits into these different categories is based on the duties that you do, not the job title. So each knock code lists the main duties of that job, and you need to see if your job fits about 80% of the duties that are listed on the website. Even if your job title is different, but your duties match, then you have to go with that knock code. And so, for example, even if you're considered a janitor, your job title is janitor, but you do the job of a CEO, then you're actually under the knock code for a CEO and vice versa. And the skills level is really important to understand when you're going to be assessing your eligibility for different PR categories. So you do want to check what they are. And when you're checking, you also want to look at the mandatory employment requirements. Underneath the duties on the knock code, they list the expected education or experience that you need to have. And you want to pay close attention to that language to make sure you can actually claim that you're working under that knock code. The other thing to note about knock codes is they do tend to change. So sometimes we see people relying on what their friends have done in the past, or, oh, someone else at my work is under this knock. You need to satisfy for yourself that your job duties do match the knock, and you need to make sure that you're assessing that appropriately and not just relying on what you read online or what other people are doing.
All right, so let's talk about some different kinds of permanent residence routes. We're going to start off with the one that most people would have heard of, and it's called the express entry. Express entry is not the end all and be all for permanent residence, but it is what the majority of economically based permanent residence applications are. So how does it work? Well, first, you create an online profile. And you can create an online profile if you qualify under one of three categories: the Federal Skilled Worker class, Canadian Experience class, or the Federal Skilled Trades class. Now, once you create a profile, you'll enter into the express entry pool. Now, just because you created a profile, does that mean that you applied for permanent residence? No, you have not applied for permanent residence. Okay. When you create a profile, you just indicate to the government that you may have qualified and you're interested. Now, when you create a profile, you get a series of points called the Comprehensive Ranking System points, CRS points, and they're based on your background. And if you have provincial nomination, you'll get 600 more points as well added to your profile. Every I want to say 1 or 2 weeks or so, the government usually has a draw, and they invite people to apply for permanent residence. They invite people based on things like which category they qualified under, um, your points, and also there's such a thing as category-based draws, which we will talk about later on. It's only after you get that invitation to apply that you can actually apply for permanent residence and you can actually submit your application. If you don't get an invitation to apply, your online profile will expire after a year and you'll be kicked out of the pool. Okay, you can resubmit your profile, but there's not much um, like you won't have ability to apply for your permanent residence unless you actually receive the invitation to apply. So what we're really looking for, beyond being able to put you into the pool, is whether or not you're getting the ITA. But let's first talk about the different programs and how you can enter the program. The first program is for people who um, have experience, 1 year of high skilled work experience anywhere in the world, and it has to be continuous, full time for in one occupation for at least a year. And then we add together the other points. It's federal skilled worker points. It's not the it's not the express entry points, but we need to look at your background points, and you need to have financial savings. So this is the really old program that's been in place for decades. Okay, and it could be for people who have never come to Canada before. You could use self-employed work experience. The work experience doesn't have, it could be when you're studying, it could be anywhere. Okay. The second one is the Canadian Experience Class. And this is the one that the government for the last year or so has been really concentrating on inviting. And this is for people who have work experience um, after or when they're not a full-time student in Canada. Again, it's high skilled. Mary went over what high skilled is. Okay. It is in Canada, and it cannot be self-employed work. What's the difference between being self-employed as a contractor and being an employee? Well, a lot of it would depend on the tax documents. We want to see that you are getting a T4 from your employer. Also, you can't just create a company and then hire yourself as well. They look at who is in control and of that company. Okay. So it's work experience. We're not self-employed. You work for 1 year, high skilled. It doesn't have to be in the same occupation. It just has to be within 3 years of application. And it doesn't even need to be continuous. Okay. And then you have to pass the language exam, which all of you will pass. But the language exam to just get into the pool will, it's the same language exam, but the level may not be enough to get you out of the pool. Okay. We'll talk about that. The third one, I'm not going to get in too much into. They haven't really selected anyone under this for years. It's called the skilled trades category. But so once you're able to enter the pool, then they'll give you a series of a points score. So what determines your score? The first one is age. You can't really get any younger, okay? But you could apply earlier and not procrastinate when you can. Because in your 30s, every year you turn 1 year older, you'll get -5 or 6 points. In your 40s is a fast slide, -10, -11 points. By the time you get to 45, it's a 0 for your age compared to someone in their 20s, which is 110 points. That could be a significant difference. Okay, so you can't get any younger, but you can try to apply earlier when you're younger. Education, if you have a 3 year program and another program on top of that, that really gives you a boost in your points. Language points, right now, because the scores are so high, we are really looking at what we call CLB 9s. So if you're doing your IELTS, we're looking at 7s in reading, writing, and speaking, 8 in listening. Or CELPIP, we're looking at 9s in every category. The relevant work experience. That's the same work experience, Canadian work experience, that I had described when talking about the Canadian experience class. Not self-employed work, work when you're not a full-time student, high-skilled, in Canada, employed work. Okay? Foreign work experience. If you have high-skilled work experience outside of Canada, that could also be counted for points. Your spouse's education, language, Canadian work experience points could add to your score. Provincial nominee programs, Mary's going to cover that. Now, you can get 600 points added to your score if you have a express entry linked provincial nomination, okay? So it's not any provincial nominee program, it has to be express entry linked provincial nomination that will give you 600 points. If you have that, then you're basically assured that you're going to be able to get chosen for the express entry. Previous study in Canada, if you did your master's, your any degree, your bachelor's degree, you get 30 points. And arranged employment. So arranged employment is where you have an employer-specific work permit or LMIA, and you have a job offer in Canada. So the post-grad work permit doesn't work because it's an open work permit, okay? You do get either 50 points or even 200 points for working as, if you're 200 points, it's an executive management level. Now, the government has said that they may be taking that away, these points away, in spring of this year. Whether or not the minister is actually going to be around to take those points away, we don't know. But that is something that we're looking at as well. If you have brothers or sisters who are Canadian permanent resident, you get 15 points. And fluency in French is a big points there as well. Okay. Trade certification, it's something for people in the construction trades mostly, or bakers or chefs. All right, so beyond the points and the category which you entered, they also have special category-based draws. And these are draws where they only invite people who might qualify under certain categories. So they have a French language one. So if you're fluent in French, you could be invited to apply for that. And then they have all these other occupations that are listed. And I put the list here, the link to the list here, where if you have at least 6 months of work experience in the last 3 years in one of these occupations, then when they have the draw for those occupations, you may be selected. Now, when they have the draws for these occupations, not everybody who falls under there can qualify. They still do look at the points, your score, but because the pool is much smaller, the score tends to be much lower than if they were going to do a general draw. Okay.
Okay, so as Elizabeth mentioned, there are also other ways to get points in express entry through the provincial nominee programs, which are also called P&Ps. Ontario's provincial nominee program is called the OINP, and there are several different types of streams under the OINP, which I'm going to take you through. So some of these streams are connected to express entry, and to qualify for these programs, you have to be in the express entry pool. And then only if Ontario is interested in you, then they can decide to send you what's called a notification of interest. And if you get a notification of interest, you can give your documents to OINP, and if they accept you, then you can get 600 points to your CRS score. So who do they give these notifications of interest out to? So you're in the express entry pool, And there's a couple categories that they've identified. The first is the human capital stream. So in order to receive a notification of interest through this stream, you have to be in the pool for express entry, and you also need to have a bachelor's degree. The bachelor's doesn't have to be from inside of Canada. It can also be from outside of Canada. And they've also specified certain candidates that they might be interested in. So in the past, this has included people in tech, people in healthcare. It can be other types of applicants. It's hard to predict which ones they'll be interested in for this stream. And that's why you just want to be in the pool. If you have your bachelor's, then you might get an invitation through or a notification of interest through the human capital stream. The next one is for French speakers. So this is for people with a bachelor's degree and a CLB level of 7 in French and at least 6 in English who are in the express entry pool. They might be able to get a notification of interest through the French stream. And then there's also one for people who are in skilled trades as well. Okay, I think we maybe need the next slide. Oh, no, I'll go through skilled trades. Okay. All right, so aside from the express entry linked streams, there are also, okay, sorry, I think I might be lagging here. I'll just quickly cover skilled trades. So skilled trades, you just need to be in the pool and you need 1 year of work experience within Ontario within the last 2 years, and then you might be able to receive a notification of interest. You don't need a bachelor's for that stream either. Okay, so moving on to the non-express entry linked streams. So those previous streams that I was talking about, those are the ones that give you 600 points under express entry. These do not give you 600 points. They are not connected through express entry. They're through a separate application process. So there's a lot of confusion there. These streams are a totally different process. You do not qualify or apply through express entry for these streams. These streams use what's called an expression of interest system, where you register your profile with OINP. You get a certain number of points, and then you're waiting for OINP to do a draw for your point level. They don't announce beforehand when they're going to do draws under these streams, which is why if you do qualify under one of them, it's really important to get into the pool as soon as you can. There are also different point calculations under this stream. So, for example, age isn't a factor, but location is a very important aspect of the expression of interest streams. So let's go through a few of these different streams. The next one would be the ONP Masters and PhD streams. So these are special streams in Ontario for graduates from certain universities. And the way they work, so you have to apply within 2 years of graduating from a master's or a PhD program within Ontario. You don't need a job offer under these streams, which can be great for new grads who don't have a job offer just yet, but you do need to be ready to enter the labor market. So that means that you're not planning on doing further studies and you're ready to go into the job market. So for example, if you're done your master's, you can't be planning on just going and doing your PhD. You have to be entering the job market to go under the master's stream pool. Then you have to register your profile with OINP, you get a score, and then you're waiting for OINP to do a draw and issue you an invitation to apply if your score is high enough. And given the 2-year deadline, we normally recommend registering for these programs as soon as you do meet the criteria, because it can be hard to predict when they might do a draw, and you only have those 2 years to apply under this stream. So do register for this program right away if you qualify. Okay, and then after the OINP, Masters, and PhD, we have the employer-based streams. So these streams are for people who have a job offer that meets certain requirements and for the applicants who also meet certain requirements. These streams require you to have a job offer that meets certain criteria. So the job offer has to be from a business that's been in Ontario for at least 3 years. If they're inside of the GTA, they need to show that their gross income in the last fiscal year was over 1 million and that they have 5 full-time Canadian or PR employees. Or if they're outside of the GTA, they need to make at least 500,000 and they need to have at least 3 full-time employees who are PRs or citizens. The job offer has to be full-time and permanent. There can't be an end date in your contract. It has to be for a high-skilled position as well. So Within these job offer based OINP streams, there's three different categories. There's the international student stream. So this is a great one if you're a recent grad and you have a job offer. So you need a job offer that meets those requirements I just mentioned. You need to have completed your program of study in Ontario within the last 2 years, and you need to have graduated from an eligible program. So if you're doing a bachelor's at OCAD, for example, master's, PhD, those would all qualify under this stream. Aside from that qualifying education credential, you need a high-skilled job offer that is full-time, and you need to be paid at least the low wage for your occupation according to your location of employment. The next one is the skilled worker. So for the skilled worker stream, you need to have a job offer that meets those same requirements, and you also need to have 2 years of work experience within the last 5 years in the same knock code as your job offer. The work experience doesn't have to have been inside of Canada. It can be from outside of Canada, but you do have to show that you have those 2 years of experience within the last 5 years in that high skilled job. The salary for this one has to be the median wage for your region, and there are no education requirements for that stream. And then finally, there's the in-demand job offer. So OINP has a list of occupations that qualify for this program. It's not just every occupation, it's a very specific list. And it is one of the lists that does include low-skilled jobs. So that could be something if you do find a position in a low-skilled area. In order to qualify, you need to have at least 9 months of work experience in Ontario in that same occupation. The salary also needs to be the median wage for your occupation.
So, these programs, especially the skilled worker and the in-demand program, could also be relevant for your family members, your spouse, for example. If they have the open work permit, they could then, do this job, and we could have them apply as the principal applicant. Okay, so I just wanted to, before I get on to the next category, I just wanted to let you guys know, we did a whole program for students at OCAD for self-employed work and the kind of ways that you can get permanent residence through being self-employed. So I'm not covering that today. If that is something that you are interested in doing, the recording is on our website, and we'll be sending you a link as well, for where it is that you can find our recordings on the website, and you can take a look at that. Okay, so there's one more that I wanted to have a chat with you guys about for something that where you can be employed. This is a brand new program that has just come out, and the details for everything are not known yet because it does depend on the community. So this would depend when you graduate on you going to one of the more rural communities. It's the RCIP program. You do need to have 1 year of 3 years of work experience, and self-employment doesn't count except for physicians. And since you didn't graduate from the community, you will need that 1 year of work experience. The language requirement, you guys should be fine. Education should be fine. If you have some savings or if you're working in Canada, you're fine. But the main thing is you need the community selection. So if you guys get a job in one of the more rural communities that are part of this program, a lot of the Northern Ontario cities are there, then you could apply for permanent residence as well. Because it's community selection, you do need to have that job offer, and the exact criteria for every community has yet to be announced, but that might be something to keep an eye out for. Okay, so we're going to just go over some practical advice. If, let's say, your points are just not high enough for express entry, what do you do at this point?
So the first thing you want to do is seek advice on how you can raise your points. So one thing that we often see is increasing your work experience in and outside of Canada. Sometimes you can get a lot more points for actually getting a year of foreign work experience than Canadian work experience in certain cases. So it's really important to see how you can maximize your points using your work experience. Next, increasing language score. So as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, we really recommend that people have CLB 9s in their language scores these days. So if you're not scoring that on your language test, rewrite your test until you are scoring that if you can. Increasing your education. So sometimes getting another credential can really improve your points depending on your situation. Getting arranged employment. So as we mentioned, these points may be removed in the spring of this year. Remains to be seen when or if that will happen. But that can be a great way to give yourself also more time to get further points if you do get a closed work permit after your postgrad work permit expires. Another option is getting experience under the category draws. So finding a job offer under one of those categories that's listed on the website for IRCC, you might be able to then get an invitation to apply through Express Entry that way. Getting French, so that's another big area that we see these days. It's been very popular in the last year or so for people who are French speakers to be able to get PR pretty easily. That is another one that, we'll have to see. It might change in the future depending on if the government changes. They might not be interested in the French speakers as much, but it is worth 50 points through Express Entry if you can get CLB 7s in your French exam. And then finally, qualifying under one of the P&P based programs. So the programs I listed before that give you 600 extra points. Potentially, if you can get an invitation that way, that can be a great way to boost your CRS score.
The other thing you want to do is look at alternatives. Think about different programs that we talked about. There are other routes as well that we didn't cover. And, if you come for a consult, we can certainly look at what way would work best for you.
And then trying to keep in status. So make sure that you get as long as possible on your postgrad work permit, and then plan on how you might be able to extend your work permit beyond the postgrad work permit. So if you have a cooperative employer, for example, that can be a great way to do that, just to give yourself enough time to make a competitive application for PR, either through a P&P, an alternative route, an express entry profile, and also team up with your spouse. So don't think about this as just yourself. Look at your spouse's situation if they're here working in Canada or outside Canada. They might have an option to get PR that you can work together and qualify together and get PR that way.
These days, things are changing so fast. What we tell you today is true today, but it probably won't be true next month or, probably even next week, it might not be true. So we are, keeping you abreast of news. We do try to send out newsletters through our email blasts. But when we look at different options for you, we also have to have not just one option. We normally try to do as many options as we can, plan A, plan B, plan C, so that as things shift, we could move to another alternative plan. So right now, we're going to go to the question and answer time. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. But in the meantime, if you would like to book a consult with us, we charge a discounted fee. It's only $100 for you to come for a consult with us if you tell us you've been to this webinar. Okay. And we'll go through a plan for you to talk about what you can do to reach your goals. All right, let's talk about the Q&A. Let's go through the Q&A here.
Sure. I can ask you one if you like.
Sure.
Okay. So I have a question about traveling on a study permit / TRV. Can I leave and re-enter the country if my TRV is valid until after my graduation date and come back to apply for the postgrad work permit?
So you want to try to apply for your postgrad work permit before within that timeline, right? Within 90 days of your graduation and while your study permit is still valid. Now, if you wanted to apply, you want to travel first and do that, you could. Sometimes, if you have not yet applied for a postgrad work permit, the officer may question you at the airport, because you're no longer a student. What are you doing in Canada? The other thing you want to keep in mind is you don't want to travel if you're on implied status. when are you on implied status? It's when your status is technically over. Let's say your study permit has expired or you're over the 90 days since you've completed your program. If you stay in the country while waiting for your work permit, which currently probably takes 5, 6 months to come, you're okay. You can continue to study. But if you leave the country after your status ends, your implied status is over. And even if you have a valid visitor visa, for example, and you come back into the country, you're not supposed to be working until a decision is made and you get your new work permit. So there's only a very short window of time when it might be okay for you to travel. Normally, I say if you can avoid traveling at this time, wait until you get your postgrad work permit, and then you can apply for your visa based on your work permit and then travel. That might be better to do. Okay, Mary, this person says if they're in a graphic design program, is that field a high-skilled job?
So that's a good question. It would depend on what your actual job is when you graduate and you finish your program and start working. Graphic design is normally considered high skilled, but it depends on what exactly you're doing on a day-to-day basis. So a program, it depends on actually what your job offer is as to whether that's going to be high skilled or not.
And the work that you do does not have to be related to your program of study. Okay, it doesn't really matter at all. The only thing it could matter is if, for example, you wanted to do some work that required certain education. For example, you can't work as a lawyer if you haven't gone to law school, or if you're not a CPA. Technically speaking, the definition of an accountant under the knock code is that you have to have a CPA, so you wouldn't be able to work as an accountant, for example. So these kind of things, but other than that, it doesn't have to be related.
Will the recording be sent to us once we're done?
Yes, that's the easy one. Can your part-time work count towards the Canadian Experience class?
So this is a good question. Maybe is the answer. If you're working, so after you graduate, if you're on your postgrad work permit and you're doing a part-time job, that's fine. That can count towards the Canadian Experience class once you have the equivalent of 1 year. So say, for example, you're working 15 hours a week, then you would need to work part-time for 2 years for it to be equivalent to 1 year of full-time work experience for the CEC. If you're referring to working part-time while you're studying, that does not count for CRS points under Express Entry. So it's only work experience that you get after you graduate and you're on your postgrad work permit that can give you CRS points for CEC. Okay, so for international language tests like IELTS, is there a list of exact requirements for those tests? As an example, is an 8 good enough on your IELTS?
Okay, so first of all, it really depends on your own particular circumstances as to what your points need to be for your language to be selected. Certain ones you don't really need to be that high. Certain ones you may need to. And even express entry, we look at all of your factors combined. The second thing is the overall score for your language test are meaningless. They mean nothing. We have to look at each individual score to see whether or not um, you qualify or you can get the points that you need. Okay, is there a different method for permanent residence if you move to a province like PEI?
Yes, so every province has their own provincial nominee program, and PEI has its own program as well. And it also participates in another program called the Atlantic Immigration Program, which is some of the best programs are in the Atlantic provinces. But the key is that you do have to qualify. So every single PNP has its own requirements, it has its own rules, and many of them do involve having a job offer out there and proving that you want to live there. So it's a matter of whether or not you can get a job offer out there and whether you can show that you really are planning on living in PA. But certainly, if you do get a job offer out there, you can come see us and we can talk about whether you would qualify for the provincial nomination programs out there.
Right. The programs that we talked about today the Express Entry is a federal program, so it's applicable throughout the entire country except for Quebec. Quebec, if you want to do Quebec, they have their own programs there. Okay. Ontario, the rest of the OIMP has to do with the province. So if you're moving outside of the province, so the Ontario OIMP is Ontario's provincial nominee program. If you want to go to another province, then that province will have its own programs. And then the RCIP, it is a federal program, but it's limited to the communities that are participating in it. I think Ontario has the most amount of communities, and most they're all concentrated in the northern Ontario portions. So you have to get the community to give you that selection.
Great. Can I apply for a post-work permit after I do my master's and finish my degree at two universities in two different provinces?
You technically can if you were to transfer to another university. As long as they're both in Canada, you could get your postgrad work permit. I'd have to look at your particular circumstances to make sure, but yes, it could be possible to do that. My last semester will be in the summer and my study permit expires in 2026. They want to know what is the best route to do as soon as the program is done. They worked for two jobs for 2 years, but stopped working in October 2024. Does that experience still count?
Okay, so there are a lot of questions I would need to ask to know the best route for this person. So what I recommend is that they come have a meeting with us so we can talk about their specific plan. Yeah, I think I would just need to know more information to be able to answer that for them. Okay.
So
Someone's asking,
yeah, we can't turn on your mic. That's not a function on the Zoom webinars, but you can type in your question and then we can answer it there. Okay. Yeah. Mary, are you there? Oh, I think Mary's frozen. Okay. So, which company, this person asking, which company would you recommend for better results for an express entry? I don't really understand what this question means. There's no particular job offer that, from a certain company that will give you more points. It just depends on the type of work, your different factors there. Mary, you're back. I see you blinking.
I'm back.
You're not frozen anymore.
Yeah.
Okay. This person says, if I've gotten a work permit but haven't gotten any job offers yet, what is the most important thing I need to do right now besides looking for a job to increase the likelihood that I'll get a PR? Can contract work or freelance type work count for express entry work hours?
Okay, so this is another one that we would want to have a meeting with you to see what your exact situation is. There are options in terms of what you can do, depending on, for example, where you are with your language test, what's your foreign work experience like, things like that. In terms of freelance jobs or contract positions, as Elizabeth mentioned, we did have a video where we kind of explain what you might want to do if you're going to be a self-employed person and qualify for PR that way. It becomes a little bit complicated though, so make sure you watch that video and just inform yourself about working as a self-employed person for PR because self-employed work experience doesn't count under the Canadian experience class.
Okay, it's already 1:02, so let's do one last question, Mary.
Okay, let's see here. Should we just do, so if my passport is expiring before my 3-year postgrad work permit, what's the process of extending my work permit?
So the question you have to first ask is, can I extend my can I extend my work permit? Because for many of you, probably for most of you, the answer is you may not be able to extend it. So we'll have to take a look. We'll have to look at the kind of work that you do, whether your employer is willing to do perhaps an LMIA, or if you fall under one of the LMIA exempt employer-specific work permits, etc., and look at the different options for you. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us today.
And thank you so much, Elizabeth and Mary. That was great. And I think everybody learned a lot. So thank you for your time. We really appreciate it.
It's our pleasure. Hang in there, guys. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.